I'm Ken Christensen. Today I'd like to share with you a portion of my library, a particular area of interest that I've collected over the years. As most people who read a lot and collect a lot, you end up specializing in a few areas. My personal interests really do not connect at all. There just happen to be things that have caught my fancy and I've enjoyed over the years. Now today I want to show you a small collection here of books that when you're in a used bookstore, I usually go for what they call the counterculture. Most used bookstores of any size will have a section like that. It's a very kind of large, unfocused subject matter, but what I'm looking for are books that were written during the 1960s about the counterculture. In other words, about San Francisco, about radical politics, about the whole anti-war movement, East Coast, West Coast, and some of these are just funny, and some of them are more historical, some of them are more political, but it's just fun to enter into that mentality. I tend to avoid books written much later in retrospect because I think you're looking at revisionist history, and it's just much more fun to enter into the actual times that they were written. Now this subject matter or area, they all kind of overlap, as I was saying. Up here I have some rock and roll autobiographies, everything from The Doors, Eric Clapton, Mick Jagger, Rod Stewart, etc. The Who, Ron Wood, and going into my rock and roll section here, Neil Young, a big favorite, Donovan, Bruce Springsteen, etc. The Beatles, John Lennon. Won't go too much into that. I mean, that's really a different category. But what I really want to focus on, we get down to this next shelf here, are books set in about the 60s. A lot of these books and categories sort of overlap. You go from rock and roll, hippies, the 60s, drugs, politics. They interrelate a lot. And then you have two very broad categories, as you have in all the books, of fiction and nonfiction. And what I've tried to collect are books that were what I call written in the heat of the battle, written in the 60s or early 70s. Books that are in retrospect, to me, hold a lot less interest. It's kind of selective memory a lot of times, or analysis, but it's fun to see what people were writing and thinking while all of this was going on. Haight-Ashbury and the whole rock scene with everything else. But let me start obviously with just a few classics of fiction and what everybody was reading at the time. I guess I have to admit that I'm a boomer, and so I kind of caught actually the tail end of the 60s. I first went to San Francisco in 1970 and visited Haight-Ashbury, Campton, Golden Gate Park, etc. But already you could tell that the wave had crested, and the real peak of the whole 60s in Haight-Ashbury had already gone by. But I caught a good tail end of it. Everyone at the time was reading Richard Brautigan. And I recently reread a few. They hold up pretty well. I mean, they're very light, breezy, funny, but they do kind of capture that whole attitude. What do we have here? The Abortion Historical Romance and Watermelon Sugar, Revenge of the Lawn, Trout Fishing in America, which was very big. And a couple of my treasures here. I have a first edition of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which had a big influence on me, for better or worse. And The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, fabulous book, still well worth reading, about Ken Kesey's trip across the country. And I actually bought this when I was still in high school. First edition, never done drugs before, but totally swept away. Great book. Carrying on in fiction, you know, there aren't a lot of novels written by people participating in the counterculture. And I think that's because people were too busy getting high, too busy trying new lifestyles, maybe a little bit unfocused to sit down and write a long novel. There are some though. This one, Thumb Tripping, by Don Mitchell. And there is Don outside of a used bookstore, it looks like. And Gary met Che on acid. His first trip, her last. It was at a party at school back east. Later they'd rapped about the summer ahead, and it seemed worth doing together. California, hitching the coast. Well, I did a bit of that myself. So let's see, what other novels? This is one I found extremely charming. I'm kind of surprised I picked it up. Frank City Goodbye. And I never heard of Frank City as a nickname for San Francisco, but that's what it is. And the novel is set in Haight-Ashbury. Very charming, a kooky group of friends. Really quite amazing. I've researched as Joe Cottonwood, and I didn't see anything else really about the 60s, but well worth reading. Now, I don't think it was written quite in the 60s. It was written a bit after. What do we have here? 1981. So a bit after, although it's set in the 60s. And let's see. Novels. This is a really fun one. Confessions of a Hitchhiker by Adrian Reed, and I think the cover gives you a good idea here what we're talking about. Basically, these young people spend the entire summer hitchhiking up and down the coast of California, and it really brings back what a big deal hitchhiking was. I hitchhiked quite a bit at the time, and it was so normal that I remember the summer in California, you would have people lined up on the entrance ramps on 101, 5, 10, 15 deep, and people would take their turns getting in cars. The whole country was in motion at that time. I think my very favorite novel written during the 60s about the hippies is this book here, Be Not Content, A Subterranean Journal by William J. Craddock. Now, this is kind of an odd book and an odd story. I bought this book in Michigan while I was attending Michigan State University. And let's see, the copyright on this, 1970. And so the action takes place, somewhat before that, takes place in California, mostly at the University of Santa Cruz. Now, when I bought this book, again, I was always interested in these types of things, but I didn't read it right away. Obviously, you know, we all buy books, and sometimes we read them in the order we buy them, and sometimes they stack up, and we don't get them too much later. And it was decades later that I decided to read this book. I was blown away. It is an incredible book. It's about his personal journey from basically being a motorcycle, Hell's Angel type guy, to getting into drugs in college, and then really indulging in drugs. That is LSD. And some of the best descriptions of LSD that's ever been written or filmed or anything else. It's a very powerful book. It's brutally honest, and it's very, very well written. Extremely hard to find. I think it deserves to be reprinted. An amazing book. He did write a couple other things. I guess he died tragically when he was young. There are supposedly many novels of his that were never published. A mysterious figure, Billy Craddock, that was known very well at the time, but unfortunately has really become practically forgotten. Here's a few more novels written at the time about the hippie scene, as this one says. We Are the People Our Parents Warned Us Against, by Nicholas von Hoffman. And again, the cover is pretty amazing. And this is a close-up of the whole hippie scene, written in 1968. This is one of my favorites here, The Stoned Apocalypse by Marco Vasari. And very odd book. Eventually, he wrote quite a few books as a pornographer. And this is a novel about the whole hippie scene. Actually, it's autobiographical. It's kind of hard to tell how much is fiction and how much is not. But he writes about becoming a guru and almost taking advantage of people and the gullibility of people at that time. An amazing book, really. And very sexy as he talks people into having orgies and such. I read this one not long ago, Happening at San Remo by Bruce Cassidy. Didn't really enjoy it. Very strange. It's hard to describe. It takes place at a fictional college here in California. Could be UC Santa Cruz. Kind of sounds like that area. and about taking over the campus. You know, obviously there was a lot of that, revolutionary activity and storming administration building, etc. An odd book. I mean, if you're really interested in the times, it's worth reading. But a rather odd book, and I didn't consider it very well written. And then two of the greatest books about that era, and absolutely one of the greatest, Ringo Livio by Emmett Grogan. Now, some people may know the name Emmett Grogan, who is a famous digger in Haight-Ashbury. And this book, though, starts out his early life and years of living in Europe, crazy adventures there, eventually San Francisco, the whole history of Haight-Ashbury, but an amazing writing style. Brutally honest, funny, cynical, wild adventures. It's recently been republished by the New York Review of Books, and well worth finding a copy. It used to be pretty rare to find, but it's now available, like I say, with the New York Review of Books, and truly an amazing book. And then, really, the companion to that book, Sleeping Where I Fall by Peter Coyote. And people may know him better as an actor, a narrator of Ken Burns' specials and all. But he and Emmett Grogan were closely linked at the time in San Francisco, and they were both diggers. They worked side by side, finding food, delivering food, doing all this. And oddly enough, there's a lot of back and forth between them in their books. Emmett Grogan destroys Peter Coyote, and Peter Coyote has some maybe not so nice things to say about Emmett Grogan. And both of their names are not the real names, as a lot of people did in those times, changed their names, took on their spirit names. You know, as you may know, that Roger McGuinn of the Byrds, his real name is not even Roger. He wrote away for a guru to find out his real name. I believe his name was Jim McGuinn, changed it to Roger. But both of those are excellent. And they also both have strong criticism for Abbie Hoffman. Now, in the 60s, it was a very loose confederation of people with very different causes. Everything from Black Panthers to Gray Panthers of older people, women's liberation, Native Americans, and of course kind of the hippie movement, drugs, communal living, a lot of different movements. But they all kind of came under that umbrella of being opposed to the Vietnam War. And when the Vietnam War ended, these groups kind of dispersed in their own particular movements and particular interests. But Abbie Hoffman kind of jumped in a way where there was a vacuum. A lot of young people, and I hate to use the word hippies, but seekers, let's say, were susceptible to different siren calls by people claimed to know what was going on, as Marco Vasari was talking about. But Abbie Hoffman kind of jumped right in there, and you had Revolution for the Hell of It, Woodstock Nation, and Steal This Book, which maybe somebody stole my copy of it, come to think of it. And then Abbie Hoffman's good buddy, Jerry Rubin, Do It. And there were fun advice. I mean, a lot of stuff like ripping off the man and how to not pay your bills, things like that. Other things that were popular at the time, The Student as Nigger, Hitchhiker's Handbook, The Little Red, White, and Blue Book of Revolutionary Quotations by Great Americans. Let's see. Oral History of America in the 60s, Good Times. Well, I can't show them all. This is a fun book. The Bearded Lady by Richard Atchison, Going on the Commune Trip and Beyond. Now, this guy was I guess you would say, a straight reporter, magazine writer, and he offered to write a magazine article for, I don't know if it was Home and Gardens or a travel magazine that he wrote for, and he decided to go around and check out communes. So anyway, as the book progresses, he gets more and more seduced into the whole idea, and by the end of the book he's living in a commune, and he kind of went native, as they say. But it's really wonderful because, again, written at the time and kind of exploring himself and showing that trip that a lot of people took from curiosity to participation. Ed McClanahan is an interesting writer. Famous People I Have Known, cover illustration by Robert Crumb. Talks a lot about Ken Kesey, was a good friend of his. And this one, Charles Perry's History of the Haight-Ashbury, is really good. It's a day-by-day account, and it reads very, very well. And it's amazing all of the different things that were going on at the same time. Oh, Notes of the New Underground, Us, Free Will and Frank. This is a nice book too. Thomas Farber, who is currently still teaching in Berkeley. Tales for the Son of My Unborn Child. Berkeley, 1966 and 1969. And again, describing life more in Berkeley and Oakland, and squatting and survival. Well worthwhile though. Let me show you just a couple more. A book that's surprisingly interesting and very readable is Bill Graham's autobiography. Now, as you may know, Bill Graham ran the Fillmore East and Fillmore West, and he knew everybody. He was actually a bit older. He wanted to be an actor, and so he joined the mime troupe, and he kind of found out that everybody else was so incompetent doing business. By default, he ended up kind of organizing the performances, tickets, and booking, and this kind of thing, which led him into booking rock and roll bands and eventually opening up his two rock palaces. But a very, very interesting book, and a very interesting man as well. Had an amazing life even before he ever came to California. Survivor of the Holocaust. Amazing story and well worth reading. Let's see, what was the other one here I wanted to mention? Yeah, this one is sort of a prequel to the whole hippie movement. And it's Tales of Beatnik Glory by Ed Sanders. Some people may remember the name Ed Sanders. He was a member of the rock band The Fugs. And this book is about beatniks in Greenwich Village. And really, it reminds me a lot of the famous Scènes de la Vie de Bohème by Henri Murger. That is, Scenes of Bohemian Life. And that was the novel that the opera La Bohème is based on. And like that early novel written in 1850, which still rings true today, the artists and hippies struggling to get by, Ed Sanders created like a group of friends there and their adventures and how they tie in, and built it into this book, which is very entertaining. Well, just one other thing, and that is mentioning Tim Leary. And I've got a little Leary collection, and you can say a lot of things about Tim Leary, plus or minus, but I think he was a very sincere guy and an amazing cultural figure. And his book Flashbacks is his autobiography, probably the best book. Again, an incredible life, going from a Harvard professor to the leader of a psychedelic movement. Tune in, turn on, drop out. We all remember that. Really a very good read. And this was his book Confessions of a Hope Fiend, which is about his prison break. And where I now live is just a few miles away from the California Men's Colony, which is a euphemism for prison. And that was a prison where Tim Leary was incarcerated, and he had an amazing jailbreak aided by the Weathermen. And that's a long story, how he went from jailbreak, and then they smuggled him over to North Africa, where he lived with the Black Panthers, and then in Europe, and eventually recaptured, I believe, in Afghanistan, and brought back to prison in California. But yeah, this is more of an interesting partial story of his life, whereas the book Flashbacks, I'd highly recommend. There are some other things here. It's fun to seek them out, but as I say, people were a little bit too high or too busy to really write books at the time. So it's always interesting to kind of re-enter that whole period through the eyes of the people who were living it.